Welcome back to episode 3 of the Silent Siren, where we bring to light the silent struggles first responders face while battling PTSD. I'm your host, Jason Demo. Today's episode is entitled The Biggest Mistake of My Law Enforcement Career. But before we dive into that, I want to start the episode like I did last week. I want to tell you a story of something that recently happened in my life. I said last episode that I really wanted to start sharing with you all the different things that are happening in my life as it relates to kind of just my mental health journey. And also said last episode that one thing I'm trying to do a better job of is communicating things with my wife. I can oftentimes struggle with communication, particularly with my emotions and feelings, and I tend to just self-isolate and shut down if I'm being honest. And recently, my wife and I were having a conversation about some of the things that I've seen on the job, and particularly things that I've never really talked about with anyone before. And this is one of those calls that I told her about. I want to talk about that with you guys. Back when I was in patrol, and I think, if I'm correct, this would have been about 2007, if my memory serves me right, I got a call for a newborn baby that wasn't breathing. I had been on the job less than 2 years, so of course I started flying to that call, and I remember thinking that I was going to be a hero. Like, I was excited. And if I could get there first, I was going to be the one to give the baby CPR and save the day, and everybody was going to love me. When you're new on the job, you kind of have this grand view of everything, and you think that you're going to save the day every time you go to a hot call. And I think this was probably magnified because I was so young when I started in law enforcement. So I flew to that call as fast as I could, and I was actually really close when the call was dispatched, and I ended up being the first one on scene. I beat fire and EMS there, and not just my zone partners. I was the first one there. So I ran up to the door of the trailer, and I knocked. And I remember briefly thinking it was kind of odd that nobody was outside to flag me down, but it didn't really bother me that much. But like, normally somebody would be waiting outside for you to flag you down so you know what house you're going to, especially at night, and this was at night. And I was at the front door, and I was knocking loudly, and it seemed to kind of take forever for somebody to come to the door, which made me like kind of wonder and get maybe a little concerned. But finally some woman came to the door, and she opened it slowly, which I also thought was weird. And as soon as she opened it, I was hit with this like unmistakable smell of bleach. It was so strong. I remember wondering if someone had like potentially accidentally dropped like an entire bottle of bleach and it spilled everywhere or something like that. I was like, were they cleaning the house and they just spilled bleach accidentally? But the smell was just overwhelming. And so I immediately asked where the baby was, and where's the baby? And the woman said the baby was in the bathroom. And I remember saying, like, where? Firmly, like, lady, I don't know where your bathroom is. I've never been to your trailer before. So I was confused why there wasn't any sense of urgency. And keep in mind, I'm still thinking, like, I'm going to be the hero in my mind. And so the woman just started kind of slowly walking down the hall in this small trailer, and then she pointed to an open door in the hallway. And I remember the bleach smell was getting like even more overwhelming as I kind of followed her and was walking down the hallway. And so I walked into this small bathroom, and I expected to see someone in there like trying to revive the baby, or maybe someone holding a baby or crying or screaming or something. But it was like eerily silent in the house. Like there was nothing going on, which was also odd. So instead, I walk in the bathroom, and there's nobody in the bathroom. There's like nobody in there. And so I was kind of puzzled at first. And then I looked over, and I noticed a black trash bag, like a contractor's trash bag, in the bathtub. And I remember thinking, like, no way. Like, there's just no way. But I reluctantly reached down, and I kind of peeled the top of the trash bag back, and I saw a tiny little leg. And I remember being like sick with anger and maybe kind of confusion too, like not wanting to vomit sick, but like just this horrible pit in my stomach, like almost like horrible anxiety. And I was incredibly confused. And maybe in some ways I think I might have kind of been going into shock myself, because just I had never experienced that before, and it just like none of it made sense. So I did my job and I opened the trash bag and I pulled this baby out to check for vitals, and it was dead. And I was staring at this baby, and I noticed it was like incredibly clean, like it had been sanitized, like no blood or anything. And I remember that just kind of being odd, but I think I was just so overwhelmed. I wasn't really just putting everything together in my mind, but I was just so confused and upset. And then I kind of remember like not really knowing what to do after that. Like I didn't want to put the baby back in the trash bag. Like that seemed like a horrible thing to do. And I wasn't going to like set it on the floor or the counter or anything. And I wasn't going to like take it out and hand it to, like, I was so like just flabbergasted and confused. And you don't get any training for this. Like, hey, this is what you do if you find a baby in a trash bag. So I remember, being so young, 22, I think it was 22 at the time, 22 or 23, never experiencing anything like that in my life. There just wasn't anything that felt right to do in that moment. But then EMS got there and they took the baby out of my hands and they did their thing and checked for vitals or whatever. And then I just got the heck out of the bathroom. I didn't want to be in there anymore. And I honestly, I don't really want to talk about it anymore, other than kind of explain what I later learned had happened. So apparently the woman who would answer the door, she had a daughter, and this daughter was an obese teenager, and allegedly she had been pregnant, and they claimed that they didn't know she was pregnant. So obese teenager, mom and teenager both claim we had no idea she was pregnant. I had no idea I was pregnant. Okay, like I've heard stories of obese women being pregnant and not being aware of it, but it seems so strange and foreign to me. And I'm like, how do you not know you're pregnant? And so they claimed that this teenage girl went to the bathroom because she had a stomach ache and thought she was going to go to the bathroom. And then, surprise, a baby came out in the toilet when she went to go to the bathroom. So the mom said, she claimed that the baby was born dead. It was stillborn and there was nothing they could do. And instead of calling 911 immediately, they decided, let's just clean everything. Like that was the right thing to do, to clean it up. So that was just absolutely mind-blowing to me. I have no idea what the truth is to that. And I have no idea if the baby really was born dead. But that's a call I never told anybody about until recently. And when I was talking to my wife about this story, I started thinking about me holding babies. For some reason, I started kind of trying to recall that in my life since then. And that's a pretty normal thing, obviously, for you to do. And if you don't have your own kids, like at some point you're going to have friends or family or something that has a newborn baby. And pretty much everybody wants to hold a baby. That's a cute, fun, cool thing to do. And people always ask moms, oh, can I hold your baby? Can I hold your baby? And I started thinking about it, and I legitimately couldn't remember a single time I've held an infant since that incident. And this incident happened around 18 years ago, something like that, a long time ago. And thinking back over the years, I can remember many times declining, like politely saying, no, thank you, when someone offered for me to hold their baby. And if I'm being honest, like holding a baby has always kind of made me uncomfortable in a way. And I've never really thought about why. I just never really had that desire. And in fact, it kind of made me uncomfortable. And I've never really put two and two together until I was talking to my wife about this. But talking about this incident for the first time in my life made me actually think about why I've refused to hold a baby for so long. And I guess it makes sense, obviously, now that I actually think about it. But why in the world did I just share this story? It's certainly not for like the shock factor, and I'm not trying to upset anybody or make anybody sad or compare my story to anybody else's story of calls they've been on. But I think it's important for me to acknowledge some of the things that I'm working through in my life lately. I've never talked about this incident until recently, and now talking about it, it's clearly profoundly impacted me over the years, but I've never really thought about why or identified the implications of it. And taking the time to verbalize this and think about the ramifications over the years is kind of just part of the healing process for me in my mental health journey. And so now it's kind of like, well, where do I go from here now that I've identified this? And to be honest, I think I need to go hold a baby. I think I need to get past this and just do something that I've refused to do for so long. And I really don't want to. If I'm being honest, I'm also a bit scared about asking someone about this. I feel like I should probably be honest and tell them why I want to hold their baby. But that doesn't sound fun. Like, I'm probably going to cry if I think about it. I'm probably going to cry in, like, I don't know how I'm going to unload when I hold a baby. But that's not really a fun conversation if I'm being honest. Like, excuse me, ma'am, I really need to hold your baby because the last baby I held, I pulled out of a trash bag after it had been bleached like a restaurant floor at the end of a shift. Like, I've got a whole host of mental health issues that I'm trying to overcome, and holding your baby will really help me work through that. Yeah, can I please, as somebody who's mentally unstable right now, can I please hold your baby? Yeah, if I had a baby and someone said that to me, I'd probably run away with my baby and not let them anywhere near my baby. So, yeah, this is something I'm going to have to work through. And I'm not exactly sure how. But I hope that this story is something that maybe some of you can relate to. Not necessarily the incident, but just how things can maybe affect you that you don't realize, especially over the years. And I'm sure many of you have been to way worse calls than that and more traumatic calls, but that's just a specific example of something I was talking about with my wife recently. And it's just something that stood out that I hadn't realized how impactful it had been over the years. So yeah, that's my opening story for this week, and hopefully some of you can glean something out of that. But enough of that. Let's dive into today's episode, and I have entitled today's episode "The Biggest Mistake of My Law Enforcement Career." And in order to explain this, we kind of have to travel back to the fall of 2008. I was, at the time, a little over 2 years into my law enforcement career, and I was still in patrol at the time, and I had recently transferred to a different sector, as well as transferred to the midnight shift. At the time, I was single, and I wanted to work in a more active sector than I originally had started in, so I transferred into the hood, and instead of working 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. like I had been, I was now working 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., so working midnights when most of the action is. And I went into the hood, crazy area, young, dumb, naive guy, let's go have fun. So in August of 2008, I met my wife, and we got very serious very fast, and after only a few months of dating, we were already talking about getting married. But there was one problem. My wife, girlfriend at the time, wasn't sure if she could marry a cop. She wasn't sure if she could deal with all of the difficulties that come with marrying a first responder, particularly a police officer. You've got the long shifts, the late nights, the high stress, time away from family, but mainly that fear of something terrible happening to me every time I leave and go to work. And if if you're a first responder spouse, you understand the immense stress and worry that comes with the territory. I'm sure it's the same, obviously, for military spouses. But first responder spouses, they don't, I'll be honest, they don't get enough credit for all the difficulties they have to deal with. And kind of my heart goes out to any spouses that are dealing with a husband or wife that's a first responder. Like, I know that's extremely difficult. And not knowing if your spouse is going to be injured or worse every time they head out the door to go to work is a very difficult burden to bear. And I'm recording this on Monday, June 30th, and last night there was that sniper ambush of the firefighters, and it's just like, even stuff like that, things that you would never expect. Like, I'm sure if those guys were married, like, I'm sure their wives thought about the potential of, like, losing their husband in a fire, but you don't think about losing your spouse to a gunman in an ambush like that. And that's just crazy. I don't want to go off on a rabbit hole, but that's just awful. But it takes a special type of person to be willing to walk that road with someone and deal with that stress on a day-to-day basis. So as my wife and I were getting more and more serious at the time while we were dating, we started to naturally have conversations about this and our future and just dealing with that. And I remember her offering her concerns, which I completely could kind of empathize with. And I remember telling her that if she felt like it wasn't something she could deal with, I would completely understand. Like, I didn't want to lose her, but I would have completely understood if she couldn't do it. And I remember not pressuring her either way, but I also remember communicating that, hey, like, we should probably figure this out sooner rather than later before we get even more serious or engaged or married. Like, let's figure it out. And I remember during this time, my wife bought and read a book, and I don't remember the exact name of the book, but it was written for family members of police officers. It was something like How to Love Your Cop or How to Love a Cop or something like that. I should probably look it up. But anyway, I remember it was geared towards helping family members deal with the difficulties of having a loved one that was a police officer. So she was kind of carefully considering all of this and trying to learn more about the nature of being a police wife, which I completely understood at the time, and it didn't bother me at all. And here's kind of a funny story about this time in our relationship. And it will give you kind of an idea of where her head was at during all of this. But when we were dating, I was working midnights, like I said earlier. So I would often talk to her in the morning while she was driving to work, because she had a normal person job, normal kind of like 9 to 5-ish hours. So she'd be driving to work and I'd be headed home from my shift, and I'd be getting off work during that time. So we'd chat on the phone a lot. And this particular morning we were chatting and I was super excited to talk to her. I remember I couldn't wait to talk to her about my shift. I was a field training officer at the time, and I had a trainee with me that night. And that night we went to a call of a stabbing in progress, and the suspect had fled on foot. And so we took off towards the call, and luck of the draw, we were coming into the area and the suspect was fleeing the area in the direction we were coming into the area. He was running down the sidewalk and he was covered in blood, and we were able to jump out, apprehend him at gunpoint, take him down without incident, recover the knife off of him. Like, it was an awesome arrest and pretty cool for my trainee to get an attempted murder suspect during their field training. Like, it was awesome. And naturally I couldn't wait to tell my girlfriend about it. So I told her the story. We're talking on the phone, and do you know, you want to know what her first reaction was? And I will never forget this. I was expecting like an attaboy, proud girlfriend moment, and her just think I'm this like cool, amazing, knight in shining armor, just stud of a man. Nope. After finishing telling her the story, she paused for a second, and I remember there being kind of silence on the phone, and then she like emphatically blurted out, "What were you doing around a murderer? That is not safe." And so we laugh about this story to this day, but it helps illustrate where her head was at when we were dating. Like, the things that I was doing as a cop were unfathomable to her. It was something that didn't make sense to her, and she had never experienced any of it. So everything I was doing seemed so foreign to her, and looking back, like, that makes complete sense. So anyways, that's a funny illustration of our relationship dynamics at the beginning while we were going through all this. But thankfully, after prayerfully and carefully considering all this, she made the decision ultimately that she wanted to be with me and was willing to deal with all the risks and stress that would come with it. We ended up agreeing on one condition, though, which I'll get to shortly. But first, after we made this decision to move forward, I think this is kind of important to talk about. Like, I got injured on the job, like, right after all these discussions about me possibly getting hurt or killed or maimed on the job, and her deciding she wanted to be with me after all that and all those discussions. Like, I got in a foot pursuit and got hurt. It could not have been, like, any worse timing. I was chasing a guy with a warrant, and as I caught up to him and tackled him, I stepped in a hole, and I tackled him, and when I stepped in the hole as I was tackling him, my left knee buckled and immediately gave out on me. And once my knee buckled, my leg just kind of gave out and I collapsed to the ground, and my kneecap impacted the pavement. And so I ended up partially tearing my ACL and fracturing my kneecap when it hit the ground. I thankfully ended up not having to have surgery, but I was out of work for a couple months, 2 or 3 months, something like that, if I remember correctly. I don't remember how long it was. But to this day, I'm still waiting for my ACL to completely tear. Like, it's torn. It's just not torn in two yet. For some reason, it hasn't all these years later, but it probably will tear now that I said that. I'll probably sneeze tomorrow and tear it. But I tell that part of the story because I think it's important to give my wife credit. By the way, also, still made the arrest. He didn't get away. That's an important point of the story. But right after going through all of this, very understandable doubt and concern about potentially marrying a cop, my wife decides to commit to it, and boom, I get injured literally immediately after all that. And to her credit, she still stuck with me after that, and I appreciate that. And I'm not saying this was some major injury, and it's not like I got shot or stabbed or something violent happened to me, but it was still a pretty decent injury, and the timing of it couldn't have been any worse given what we were going through and just the decisions she was having to make. But even after all that, she said she still wanted to marry me. So this brings me to the biggest mistake of my law enforcement career. And before I tell you what it is, I want to make it clear that my wife and I, we made this decision together, and I have no anger or frustration towards her. This wasn't like her ultimatum, like she suggested it, but we discussed it as a couple and we agreed on it as a couple. And we were young and naive, and we made a decision that made complete sense at the time. And even though I now know it was ultimately a bad decision, like, I stand by it. Like, if I were to go back in time, like, obviously hindsight's 20/20, but like, given the information we had, I think we made a good decision, even though it wasn't a good decision. And I firmly believe we thought we were doing what was best for us and our relationship. But we decided that the best thing for our marriage, and particularly to help my wife not stress as much and protect her, we decided I was not going to discuss any of the bad things that I saw at work with her. We made the decision that I wasn't going to tell her about the dangerous situations that I was in. We weren't going to talk about the difficult calls. We weren't going to talk about the extreme sadness or gory details of the things that I was seeing on a regular basis. We definitely weren't going to talk about dead babies and trash bag calls. That was not going to happen. And at the time, like I said, it made complete sense to both of us. She didn't want to know about all that crap, and I honestly didn't want her to have to know about all that crap. I didn't want her to have to carry that burden. And I think honestly, that's part of the reason first responders do what we do. It's a way for us to deal with all the messes and craziness of society so that our friends, and particularly our loved ones, don't have to. I don't want my wife to hear about the baby that I found in a trash bag. I don't want people to have to deal with that and know about that. We bear those burdens so others don't have to. So we moved on with our lives. We got married, and for like my whole career, I didn't tell her anything except the feel good stories. Only told her the funny things that happened and only talked about the cool stuff. So that was the biggest mistake of my law enforcement career, and neither of us knew it at the time. And here are kind of some observations about how that negatively impacted me and my mental health over the years. First, I went to the police academy in 2004, so it's been over 20 years. And if you think back to that time, kind of in America, 2004, we're only a few years past 9/11 and into the war. And when it comes to the military, we were doing a pretty terrible job back then of taking care of our veterans as it related to their mental health. Like, we've all heard horror stories about the VA and lack of help for veterans, and particularly 20 years ago. We're talking about 2 decades ago. I wasn't in the military, but thankfully, we've seen kind of a big surge in mental health resources for our service members over the years, especially after having so many soldiers come back from Iraq and Afghanistan suffering with mental health issues. And we hear those stories all the time. There's all kinds of like programs and nonprofits and resources for veterans. And the reason I bring up the military aspect is if we weren't doing a good job to educate and equip and help heal veterans about PTSD and mental health issues back then, you can imagine how non-existent it was for first responders back then. Like, we've got people going to war and coming back to war, and we're not taking care of them. So we certainly weren't going to be taking care of first responders. And looking back, I can't remember a single block of training about police officer mental health from the police academy. And I also can't remember a single block of training when I got hired at the sheriff's office back in 2006. And like, to be fair, both of those experiences were a long time ago, and perhaps I've forgotten about something that was said. And while there may have been something that was said back then, there certainly wasn't extensive training or like classes about it, at least not at my agency or my academy. And I went to a pretty large academy and worked at a very large Central Florida agency. And so I don't remember anyone warning me about what I was going to experience on the job, and I definitely don't remember any education about how to find ways to cope and deal with the job in a healthy manner. And in fact, like, the only real coping I remember back then was like, hey guys, let's go out and get some drinks after work. Like, let's just go hang out, pound some beers, decompress a little bit, and then go sleep. So like, where am I going with this first point? Well, like, my wife and I, we made this decision for me to not talk about the horrors of the job based on the limited information we had and no education about it. Like, nothing. Nobody warned me about bottling things up. Nobody told me to make sure I was regularly speaking with someone or anyone about what I was seeing on the job. Nobody was offering like professional help or guidance back then. None of my field training officers talked about it. None of my supervisors talked about it. And like I said, nothing was said in the academy. And in fact, like, looking back at my career, the only time I can remember any help offered was when a deputy in my unit was murdered in the line of duty. He got shot and killed in the line of duty. And I remember them bringing our whole unit into HQ and like telling us as a group that they were going to give us, it was either like a week or two off work to process everything. I don't remember, but they gave us a little bit of time off work. And I remember them like passing out a number or a card or writing it on a whiteboard or something. There was like a number that we could call if we wanted to talk to somebody. And if I remember correctly, I feel like it was just kind of like the suicide hotline or something like that. But I remember we didn't get any like mandatory counseling or therapy or anything like that. So where I'm going with this is there was virtually no resources or education offered to me during the police academy or my time on the job. Like, I was walking into a mental health minefield, and I had no idea that I was walking into it, and I had no idea how to navigate it either. And I had no idea that not talking about this stuff that I was seeing on a daily basis could have a severe negative impact on me. So I fell into this habit of not telling my wife anything negative about the job, which we agreed on. And again, like I said, I feel like we had good intentions with that. The problem was I didn't stop there. I didn't talk to anybody about it. Once I started having mental health issues a few years later, after we had gotten married, I didn't know really where to turn. I had bottled everything up for years at this point, and I wasn't going to talk to my wife about it because we agreed not to. And I wanted to protect her, and I didn't want her to have that burden. And there was zero chance I was going to talk to any of my coworkers about it. Like, I didn't want them to think I was a nut job. I really didn't want them to think that I was a liability because I was, like, potentially mentally unstable or something. Like, I was worried about that. I told you guys in the first episode that I spent the last several years of my career working violent fugitive cases. And so the last thing I was going to do is tell the dudes that I was kicking doors with that, hey, I'm drinking myself into oblivion at night just to numb myself and be able to go to sleep. And I'm having nightmares and I'm getting angry all the time. And I'm having flashbacks and just episodes and all these things. Like, I didn't want any of them to think that I couldn't do my job when we were hitting a house or doing a takedown. I wasn't going to talk to any of my supervisors about it either, for fear of, I didn't know if, like, I could lose my job or if I was going to get placed on light duty, which was, like, miserable to me if I was going to get placed on light duty, or am I going to get assigned to some shrink for some mandatory woosah therapy sessions that were just going to suck and be terrible. Like, and even to take all this a step further, you're taught in the job, just suck it up. Like, no matter what call you go to, especially like in patrol, it's even worse if you work at an active agency where you're going call to call to call every night. You're taught to just suck it up. Like, you know what my supervisor said to me? Or not even said to me, but you know what he had me do after that dead baby call? Like, hey, there's calls holding. Write your report at the end of the shift tonight. Don't worry about writing your report now. We've got to get some of these calls off the board. There was no, hey bro, are you okay? That was a rough one. There was no questions or concerns about my mental well-being or where I was at after that. And, like, to be clear, I'm not blaming my supervisor. That's just the nature of the job. Like, you aren't supposed to let any of this stuff affect you. Your supervisor isn't going to offer for you to, like, go home for the rest of the shift so you can decompress. Like, that would screw over your zone partners for the rest of the night, and there's too many calls holding. You got to suck it up and move on to the next call. And I'm gonna dedicate an entire episode to this, but if you're not aware, like, you have to pass a psychological exam in order to get hired in law enforcement. I'm pretty sure every agency requires it. Everywhere that I applied required it. But, like, you have to be deemed psychologically fit in order to get hired as a police officer. You never have to pass that test again. Like, let that sink in. Like, these agencies want to make sure you're mentally fit for duty before they hire you. It's so important that you have to pass this test before you get hired. But they never make that evaluation again. I think there's several clear reasons for that, but I'll discuss that in a future episode. But I think it's worth pointing out. So, what's kind of the point of me sharing this, of not talking to my wife and not talking to anybody, and just kind of where am I at right now? Well, I spent an almost 9-year career, and the following 10 years, this February was 10 years since I've been out. So close to 2 decades, I spent all that time never talking about any of this stuff. Like, I have bottled it up for a very, very long time. And I'm learning now, unfortunately, how deeply and profoundly that has impacted me in a negative way. There has been no release for me for any of this stuff up until recently. And one problem that I didn't anticipate from all of this bottling up over the years is how it's become so habitual for me. My wife now is more than willing to talk about these things. She has offered many times, especially recently, to sit and listen if I want to talk about things. Like, I've had episodes where I'm just like crying and completely losing it and just feel like I'm absolutely losing my mind and just like holding my head, and just I've said things to her like I've got just these demons in my head that I just need to get out, and she offers to listen, and I don't talk about it. It's something that I'm working through, but unfortunately it's just this bad habit that I've created over 2 decades, and it's not going to be something that I can just poof fix overnight. So here's my encouragement to any of you out there that are struggling with mental health issues and bottling things up, particularly whether you're a first responder, military, nurse, doctor, dispatcher, or just a regular citizen. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, it applies to all of us with mental health issues. You've got to find someone to talk to. You've got to reach out for help. And I'm admitting this right now. I am by no means a good example of this. And I still suck at it. But I'm finally learning to do this in some small ways here and there. And I need to get better at it. And I will tell you, there is no doubt in my mind I would have ended up dead if I kept going on the path that I was going on. Go find a trusted friend to talk to. Talk to your significant other about it if you've agreed to do that. Go seek professional help. Go chat with someone who's neutral, who's not even directly involved in your life, but willing to lend you an ear to listen. Just find someone that will allow you to unload this stuff. I had no idea how heavy this stuff was until I started unloading some of it. And I have unloaded a very small portion of it, but I can already feel, like when I was telling my wife about the baby call, and I told her about a few other calls that night a few weeks ago when we were talking about this, like I felt there was a burden lifted. And I'm not saying it cured everything and made everything better, but there was something about just getting it out in the open that helped. And I remember when we were talking, my wife said something like, my gosh, like I can't believe you had to see this stuff. Like after, like she was pretty silent during the whole time I was talking about stuff, and she was just like it almost was validating, like, because she was just like, whoa, that's some heavy stuff, and I can't fathom that. And that didn't fix things, but it made me feel better, like, okay, I'm not crazy, like this is not normal stuff. And like I've said before, talking about this stuff in episodes, these podcast episodes, it helps me. I can talk about all of these things and not have the pressure of having to sit face to face with someone. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't talk to people in person, but I've told you guys that one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is because it forces me to talk about things that I've refused to talk about for so long, so many years. And I don't have all the answers. I don't have some magic pill that fixes everything for you or for me, but I do know what I've learned is that bottling everything up is not the answer. Keeping it inside, no matter how noble your reason is not the answer. It exacerbated this problem for me for years and years and years. And I truly hope that me sharing some of these things can help you or encourage you in some way. And I appreciate all of you. And I thank you for listening. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. I am Jason Demo, and this is the Silent Siren. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Proverbs 17:17.